and co-author of both the Professional Development Design Framework as well as the Framework for Leading NGSS Implementation. So we are honored, Susan, that you are here and can join us and can lead us through this first webinar.
Thank you, Kathy, and hello to many old friends and hopefully new friends. I'm very happy to join the NEXUS group and to share some of our work with you. As Kathy mentioned, she and Joey had let me know that they had introduced the framework for leading next generation science standards to all of you briefly, but that it would be worthwhile to dig in a little deeper to unpack some of the content there. So we've put together this webinar to help with that, but I want to just say that, you know, my favorite thing always is to connect with people personally and to do more of this work face-to-face. And if there are any of you who would want to just chat further after this to go in a little deeper on any of these concepts, feel free to reach out to us. So let me share the session goals with you, which is next, that we want to introduce, you know, this framework kind of at the big picture level again, but then we're going to spend most of our time dipping into 6 key areas of the leadership knowledge needed for implementation. Besides our work around professional development, Kathy and I led for about 15 years WestEd's National Academy for Science and Mathematics Education Leadership. And in that, you know, we were always just enjoyed how people, you know, would get tapped in their districts, regions, or states to suddenly be the science or the math leader, and then suddenly get into this kind of sometimes fear, sometimes just help me. What is it that I really need to know and be able to do in order to carry out my role as an effective leader, and particularly as a leader of education reform. And back then, we were really grappling with the introduction of the new National Science Education Standards and the NCTM principles and standards for school mathematics. And people were grappling with similar issues I think we're grappling with today around what we need to do as leaders to guide and support those changes. So we'll dip into the 6 areas of leadership knowledge that we've identified and just talk a little bit about some of what we've learned. We want to introduce the critical actions that are in the framework. Those are, at least, you know, when we developed it, the key areas that any leadership team thinking about implementation should have on their list of things to do, and talk a little bit about that. Share some examples of ask you to share some examples of professional learning focused on implementing instructional materials and what strategies are needed. We'll talk a little bit about that in the context of introducing our framework for professional development design, but I want to hear more from all of you around that, as well as examples of how you're planning instructional materials adoption and organizing professional development. And finally, we'll give you an opportunity to just identify any additional information or resources that you'd like for us to track down for you in support of your work through NEXUS. So those are our goals, and hopefully we'll be able to hit them all in our short period of time. So I think you've all seen the framework for leading next generation science standards implementation that was developed last year. Prior to us kicking off NEXUS. In a way, it was a precursor to really thinking about what is some of the content and the areas of work that NEXUS can support a cadre of leaders in. And the framework addresses the big question of what do leaders need to know and be able to do in order to lead the implementation of standards. And you can find it again right there at that link. Next slide, Anna. The framework itself is organized into 4 overall domains. So going from left to right, I'll unpack a little bit of each of these domains, and then we'll get into a little more of it in a few minutes. But just before I do that, I think I wanted to share when we first came to this question of how do we identify what is the most critical knowledge for leaders to have to lead NGSS implementation, we turned to the literature first, did a comprehensive lit review, and not probably surprising to a lot of you, a lot of the research focuses on leadership for particular, math interventions or ELA or school turnaround, many other areas, and there wasn't a lot that really focused very specifically on leadership knowledge for implementation science standards. But nonetheless, we unpacked a lot of that research and identified those lessons learned that related to providing skills and knowledge for leading major reform. And then to get a little more in depth, we conducted over 24 interviews with practitioners leading national science standards implementation in Washington and California, 2 states that were early adopters and moving this forward, and really found out from them what are some of the key things that you faced, what did you need to know to be able to do this. And then finally, we convened a group of national and state leaders in science to come together and really put this together. So this is really a product of a lot of thinking, a lot of good thinking, and a lot of good experience from around the country. So going from left to right, as we begin to ask the question of what do leaders need to know and be able to do to implement NGSS implementation, we identified 6 primary areas of leadership knowledge. And in a few minutes, I'll talk a little more about each of those. We also, going to the middle, the second domain, we identified a host of critical actions necessary to be planned, implemented, data gathered on, and then continued over a fairly long period of time to continue to implement NGSS. We also identified the third domain, which talks about what do we need to attend to sustain implementation of next generation science standards. And that is framed around what I call the 4 Ps, paying attention to people, policies, practices, and processes. And we'll come back to unpacking that a little bit as well. But we have to always keep in mind that those 3 domains are really pressing on and influencing the main story that's in this framework, and that is the vision that we're driving toward. And so the 4th domain, the systems drivers, suggests that there are a multitude of things that touch on the classroom, students, and teachers most closely. That is, adopting and implementing standards themselves, identifying our strong standards-aligned curriculum and working on its curriculum instruction assessment that's aligned to those standards. That we're able to enact, or in some cases, really eliminate policies that are getting in the way of the creating that strong intersection of teachers, students, and access to NGSS. That we are engaging with with key stakeholders to build the necessary supports. And sometimes I like to remind people, it's not just the usual suspects. For years, we would kind of gather up some of the same people and work with them. But today, I think the broad engagement of both the public and particularly parents in education has forced us to think even more broadly about how we reach a very wide range of stakeholders and help them understand what NGSS is, what three-dimensional learning is, and why it's important for their children. And then in addition, other systems drivers, we always have to say the F word, funding, not that other F word, the funding word, that is so critical because some of this is going to take some thinking about if not how we get more money, at least how we reallocate some of the resources we have, rethink professional development, how we find the support for it, and also, you know, in the future ideal world, we'll be able to reallocate maybe some of the time and effort we spend on recreating instructional materials all the time so that we can really get those resources we need. So we put this all together in sort of one big picture, and in order to be able to invite all of you to think about how you are developing these knowledge bases in your teams and in your states, how you are planning for the critical actions that are in, you know, domain 2, and how you're attending to the 4 Ps to drive towards this, you know, vision of equity and access to NGSS. So at the biggest picture, that's the framework. And I want to just start with domain 1 and just unpack a little bit. But before we do that, let me just invite you, if you do have questions that are coming up for you, or you say, this is something I want to learn more about, please use the chat, and Joey will be monitoring the chat and will stop us to answer any questions or elaborate. Let me pause. Joey, any questions at the moment or comments?
Not in the chat right now, Susan.
Great, thank you. So starting with domain 1, the 6 areas of critical leadership knowledge we've identified through our research and our work with practitioners are listed there in on the framework. I want to start first with what do leaders know about NGSS? For NGSS, clearly, that's kind of our content knowledge of our leadership work, if you will, for most of us. Anna, can you just go to the next slide? Sorry. That what we all have to be extremely fluid in is not only the what of NGSS in terms of the vocabulary, the structure, the conceptual shifts being made, but also what really importantly, sort of what does that look like in action? What does the vision of the instructional approaches for students and teachers look like in the classroom? How do we help people understand the big why of this? Because in our role as leaders, we're not only implementing the ideas, the concepts, the practices within NGSS, but we're also having to be an advocate for and enlisting others in seeing that vision. And it's, we'd love to have a conversation about what people are seeing, but I think it's for many people who have not been a part of discussions or opportunities to really think about what's inside the vision and what's inside the framework for NGSS, it is very, very foreign territory for them. And having us as leaders serve as translators and helpers to help really unpack that is critical. So we start with that as key knowledge. And I neglected to say that in the framework, besides laying out all of these areas of knowledge that we are supporting leaders of science to develop, we are also providing reflection questions for you to think about. You know, where are you relative to your understanding of each of these knowledge bases? What are the areas that you would like to increase your knowledge? And then both in the framework and increasingly now that we've launched the NEXUS website, we will be providing resources for you that you can use with your teams and your colleagues to go deeper in each of these knowledge bases. So beginning to start to get out some visions of what teaching and NGSS looks like, what is all, and gathering those resources and having them at the ready is part of being a leader. We used to say in our National Leadership Academy that leaders are a source for other people. You're someone that people can go to and say, I'm struggling, or can you show me this? And so having those resources at your ready of what this looks like is really the first knowledge base that we flag for this work. And giving people, like, for example, I know I was able to be with you at the convening in October, but I know you all had an opportunity to engage in that the sound unit based on the experience aligned to NGSS, to experience as a learner what this is. And that's an experience that I think we all need to have in order to deepen our understanding about NEXUS is work, and also the NGSS. So let me stop there, and we're going to do our first quick poll. Ask you if some of your thinking. So ensuring all students have access to high quality, three-dimensional learning is today's most important equity issue in science education. Do you strongly agree? Oh, excuse me, strongly disagree? Disagree? Are you neutral? Agree or strongly agree? Take a minute to complete the poll. Joey, let me know if you've got,
Almost everyone.
okay, just give it another 30 seconds.
Sure.
Oh, the poll, Brian says the poll is not showing up for him. Sorry, Brian.
Brian. Brian, you might have the window closed. You might need to reopen it, and it might pop up for you. If anyone else, okay. Okay. I think that'll probably be it, Susan. So we have 19 of the 22.
Yeah, let's publish the poll results.
And poll, okay. Can you see the results there?
Not yet.
There we go.
There we go. So we've got a range of answers. Most people agree, not strongly, but 63% agree with that statement. And I would admit that was also my response, because I think there is a lot of competition for what are some of the strongest issues around equity in terms of students that we are considering. And I'd be interested for people who would feel comfortable putting in the chat where you strongly disagree. What is the basis of that? What are some of the other equity issues that you think are really much more important than accessing high quality three-dimensional learning? And just, to be among friends, would love to just see some of your thoughts about that in the chat, and we'll come back to that. Thank you. Joey, do you want to say any more about that?
No, that's it. I will stop sharing the poll right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that was teeing up to really our second area of leadership knowledge that we've identified in the framework as critical, and that is what leaders need to know about equity. I think equity has been on everyone's list as one of the major topics to address all aspects of education. I think that increasingly there's a recognition that our schools are not, in general, operating well for the diversity of students. There's the performance data, as well as data released recently by the U.S. Department of Ed Office of Civil Rights, shows that the African American students are less likely to pass Algebra 1, less likely to have advanced math and science classes than their white and Asian peers. These limit their future opportunities in science. The whole hope with high quality instructional materials that are designed to meet the needs of many children is that they will be part of the solution, that ensuring every child access to a guaranteed curriculum that has been well designed and aligned to the standards we need kids to address is important for that reason. In addition, understanding what culturally responsive instruction is, and being able to help the people we work with as leaders to come to awareness of what kinds of instructional practice really support all learners. This means, really considering who are our children, who are our students, what are their interest backgrounds, and being able to learn how to leverage and build on students' experiences in the classroom, coming from an assets and strength. So NGSS, called out equity as such a critical part of, its work, and provided a series of case studies within NGSS that we've provided the link there. We encourage all of us to look to those case studies. They address the instruction of children broadly, including, all children. The majority of public school students are increasingly non-white. Anywhere from 15 to 18% of our students are students with disabilities. We still have, while we've really worked on the gender gap in STEM, there's still some particular educational strategies that can be used in the classroom to encourage boys and girls in different ways to help them learn science topics and engage in science topics effectively. And the instructional material the strategy of ensuring that we have consistent, well-designed, high-quality instructional materials in every school and district, and that they're consistent from, real pie-in-the-sky vision here, that consistent across districts in substantial ways is something that needs work, because it can help address the issues that arise from student mobility, which is also an equity issue, and it can be high for military families and especially for economically disadvantaged students. So in encouraging you to develop and share what you know within our community about equity, it's because we see this as a central aspect of what leaders do to model how we can get quality science education to the students who really have not had that historically. And looking at, again, as I mentioned, the framework provides some questions for reflection, but also this link to resources. And this is not the only one. I wanted to highlight the case studies because they do provide very specific examples of at the classroom level of how we can do this. But there are many, many other ways that in our work within states, we need to think about how we are putting equity at the center. So that is a key knowledge base for all of us. Next slide. Oh, we have another poll so quickly. So we want to make sure everybody's still with us, I guess. This poll is asking you, most teachers prefer to develop lessons independently rather than use district school developed curricula and instructional material.
Oh, looks like it got
Sorry.
cut off. Sorry.
Yes. Do you strongly agree, disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree?
With a reminder that strongly disagree is at the top.
Oh, sorry.
No. Just
That's sort of anti-intuitive to me for some
I
reason.
know.
Maybe because I'm so agreeable.
probably another 30 seconds for folks.
Okay.
Okay. It's a lot of variability there.
The majority, 50% disagree with that statement, and we have 30% who agree. I wonder if we could have a volunteer raise your hand, and maybe we could actually call on Leslie, who's made a comment that this depends on whether teachers are given the voice in selection or development of district-wide curricula. I think that is very true. Leslie, would you like to unmute and just say a little more about that?
Sure. I've been noticing a trend away from I want to build it myself and be in control to I recognize there's more towards building this, but I don't want to just be told what to do. So I think that there's this place where I'm seeing some of our districts here in Massachusetts really pull together teacher leaders and have them be part of the decision making around a selection of a ready-to-go curricula or revisions to curricula that they have, or in some cases, I was working with some Cambridge teachers yesterday in the co-construction of a district-wide group around a specific grade curricula unit. So I think it's changing.
Great. And there was another comment in the chat, Susan, about that it greatly varies depending on the quality of the curriculum and their buy-in and teachers.
Yeah, Mike, would you like to add to that comment a little bit? Unmute.
Sure, yeah.
Another person from Massachusetts.
Hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm taking a perspective of my wife being a teacher. She actually works for Cambridge, this is what she's talking about. So they have tons of resources and they are changing their curriculum quite frequently, but it's not necessarily, if the teachers aren't involved in the process, they don't really have buy-in and it's not really fitting their needs. My wife's school is one where they do looping. Mm-hmm. So she has a third grade classroom one year and then she'll travel with them to the next year to fourth grade. And not all of the third and fourth grade teachers get to actually pilot and test and give comments on the curriculum. So she might be given a science curriculum that she had nothing to do with. It might be the other teachers that are the other part of the team that got to pilot the year before, and vice versa. So for her, it's kind of frustrating.
Yeah, I bet. And I think that really brings up the reason why it's important for us as leaders to be able to really speak broadly about what are the pros and cons of adoption versus development for instructional materials. I think we've been through many years, and Roger Bybee is on this call. I could ask Roger to speak to this. Many years of developing curriculum, putting it out there that's very, very carefully designed, using, cognitive research, understanding learning, but in over the years, those curriculum for the most part were rather stayed in the kind of boutique use zone. 10-15% of districts nationwide would use them, and I think districts, both because they think it's a resource issue, and to support teacher buy-in and control, often do spend an inordinate amount of time and resources, though sort of recreating the wheel. And so I think maybe just go to the next slide, Anna. What do leaders need to know about instructional materials? And I think we really need to understand deeply, what, again, back to the first knowledge base we shared, what is entailed in NGSS or in three-dimensional learning, what really is needed. And is it really in our kind of best interest to have teachers developing materials every year, all the time, and just in time, for their work. Is there, at least some sort of basic set of materials that can really support them, and so that their time and energy in the tweaking and the designing and the enriching is spent in those areas, and not, really having to do so much around that because of the complexity of three-dimensional learning, and it's easy to miss some part of it. So I think the effective leaders help teachers and other instructional staff to really make the best use of their valuable time and their expertise. And and very often it's not to create from scratch all the time instructional materials. I saw one statistic that nationally every teacher spends somewhere over 4 hours a week just planning or finding the resources for their next lesson. And I think it's the issue. You could still adopt and support the implementation of vetted instructional materials while engaging teachers and really just building that buy-in that Mike, you were talking about. And I think that's really critically important. And let me just ask Roger if you have anything to add to that.
I would just briefly point out that if you have teachers develop a unit, they're not continuously developing the whole program all the time, etc., as you mentioned, Susan, that they're developing a unit, and now I want to highlight, with professional developers assisting, kind of monitoring, providing some leadership. There's every opportunity for the teachers doing that to develop capacity, to select better materials, if that's what they're going to do, or to adapt current materials, if that's what they're going to do. So there are learning outcomes that can be embedded in the development of a unit, as well as some of the other dimensions that you've listed in the leadership. They'll learn more about NGSS. They'll learn more about what to do relative to equity in the classroom or equity in materials, etc. So I'll just point that out, that there can be an advantage to it, but not to overdo it, and especially not to just turn to the teachers and go, well, we have these new standards, I guess you better go off and develop some materials. That's probably not the best option to exercise.
Yes, thank you. I think that we'll talk about our professional development framework in a minute. And, as you know, we have always included a sort of a curriculum development and curriculum implementation strategy as a part of what teachers can engage in to have they themselves be their professional development, and to learn alongside people who know how to sequence curriculum and how to ensure that the standards are all reflected in a meaningful way. And so being able to really, navigate that I guess, dichotomy is important for us as leaders. And in addition, I think what's needed is, for us as leaders to be able to help people ensure that they have high quality instructional materials. They may not, be ready to adopt a whole cloth. There aren't a lot, let's admit, yet that we can adopt fully to address the three-dimensional standards, but they're starting to be. But rather, there are tools like, working really, developing a storyline or other materials that would help to ensure that what is being developed is quality. And I think as leaders, that's what we need to know. How are we ensuring quality and consistency? And if you teach in this school versus that school, that you have kids who have as much access to knowledge that we're trying to create as other kids. So, and the other areas that we need to think about with respect to instructional materials is that when we are engaging in a development or an adoption or implementation, that we need to know how to develop and specifically monitor the comprehensive and sustained implementation plans, because it happens over a long period of time. And I'd like to advocate for helping districts really think about how developing the science teachers is aligned to the regular and ongoing systems for talent development in the district and school. That too often we've thought about the next, science adoption, or the next, redo in the summer of what we're going to do around the new standards as just a one-shot event that we bring everybody together, we figure out what we're going to do, and then, roll it out in the next school year. And instead, I think many districts we're working with are becoming much more thoughtful about how they have more ongoing systems of what we do with our cadre of science teachers every year, and what the science teachers themselves lead in their grade level teams and in their departments to continue to get deeper and richer on their implementation of their curriculum, and supporting some of those and codifying them as part of, I think, our leader work, supporting the central offices and the principals and thinking about how do they embed that in their ongoing induction and talent development systems in their districts. And then, I think another area that we all need to know and be able to address is how do you help the building leaders around making wise choices about the instructional materials development, adoption, selection. Very often they've been left out of the process. Many of them don't know the NGSS, they don't understand it. And so I think part of our work around promoting high quality instructional materials must be engaging building leaders and helping them to learn enough about NGSS to be an effective leader, and supporting them to build teams that have a sense of commitment to science education taught this way, and really a sense of their own collective efficacy, that they can do this, they can really make it work. And so all of those, we provided some additional examples in the framework and some resources, but these are areas that we really need to address. And let me just stop there and ask Kathy, did you want to add anything else about this one at this point?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is thinking about, and in the framework, it goes to that idea of the sustainability. And I know you're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but it's this idea, if we don't have an eye toward sustainability and we're not thinking about the cycles of what it means to implement over time and to support both teachers and the leaders, and building on our knowledge and understanding in the knowledge domain of change. What can we expect over time? I think all of that sort of supports and goes hand in hand with what we as leaders need to know and think about and support others to know as they take action on that area of instructional materials.
Thank you. And let me just ask Joey, any action in the chat that you want to call out?
There were some comments on the last poll connecting through the selection of instructional materials and how it's tied to teacher professional learning. We just got another one in the chat box as I said this, so give me 1 second. I don't know, Rachel, you just left a comment. Would you like to chime in and chat at all?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Besides, my chat got cut off at the end because I hit the send button too quick. I want to thank Roger from validating what we are doing in our district. We we are in a district that where the elementary schools were not teaching science. Most of the teachers not have the background, were scared to death of it. So being a STEM coach, I worked with the teachers, and we're trying to build capacity. And one of the best ways of building capacity we have found is to offer course training on NGSS, but that unit writing. You know, I work with a group of teachers that have been already trained, so we don't have to do the training on NGSS. Well, we're still always doing the training, but I work with them, and together we build these units from scratch, and or from stuff that has already been developed that we can change to make better. And it has, from my stance, it has been an incredible experience to watch the teachers' growth. You know, from the being, I don't like science, I don't want to do this, to now they want to teach it all day long. It has been incredible. But what, you know, in talking to other districts in my area in Connecticut, you know, what I have found is that schools in general don't have either the expertise in-house to be able to do that, or do not have the capacity to do that. So we've been talking, can we take this process and expand our process to other districts around? Connecticut is a local district ownership type of thing, so I'm not sure if we can do that, but it has been an incredible experience to watch these schools that wasn't teaching elementary science at all to now, you know, teaching it all the time, every day.
Thank you for that, Rachel. That's very exciting, and I think, you know, in a state the size of Connecticut, it would be nice to see if that could be scaled up. We used to talk about all the time about whether everybody has to have the actual experience of developing the units, or is there some sort of version of that could be, you know, scaled up to a whole state? I mean, I think there is such a power in a group of teachers coming together, studying the standards, and then developing the units, if you can go the full you know, the full route. But is there a way that some of those teachers who are doing that could create these sort of centers of innovation to help the next group to come in and do it? I think that would be worth exploring. So let's move on. I know we've got a lot of ground to cover, and this is a great that you're all participating. So the next area of knowledge that we have in the leadership framework is, you know, that leaders need to know a lot about professional learning. And this is a very incomplete list, but we've flagged that, you know, it's critically important to know the standards for professional learning from Learning Forward. Most states have adopted those standards. You can go to the next slide, Anna. I think these are probably familiar to all of you. Most states have adopted standards that reflect or closely aligned to Learning Forward standards. I know a couple of folks on my team are working with Rhode Island right now that they're updating their own version of these standards. We've worked with Delaware and Maryland and some other states around professional development standards. And so any of us trying to design next generation science standards professional learning should ensure that there are links to and our work is reflecting these standards. There are links to these resources within the framework document, as well as in the NEXUS website. I think people tend to know the standards at sort of this level, but then need to really get inside them and identify which ones are strong and which ones are need to be improved. And I think we're still trying to, still working on figuring out what are some of the best learning designs in support of an NGSS implementation. Another one of the 7 that I see people struggling with somewhat is the data standard, to ensure that the professional learning uses a variety of sources and types of student educator and system data, so that the professional development is designed to be aligned to the needs of the district and the teachers and the students, and that we are then looping back through to gather data to look at what has been the quality of the professional learning and what adjustments do we need to make. So this resource, as long as some others, are included in the framework. If you don't, as a leader, if you're not familiar with standards, we think it's a critically important piece of understanding effective professional development. And there's also resources for each of these standards. So for example, with the data standard, we've used extensively the resources from Thomas Guskey, offering very practical advice and guidance around how do you evaluate professional learning on an ongoing basis, and how do you go from the very early on, a level of participant reaction, and how did our teachers like this experience, all the way to our professional learning activities, job embedded learning, coaching, really making a difference in student learning. And so thinking about how we help schools, regional centers, the state evaluate professional development is a critical piece of this.
And Susan, I'm going to just interrupt real quickly and remind all of us, thank you for the prompt again, Sam, for considering also the Learning Forward's professional standards for thinking about professional learning and the many varied components of it and content areas, and that CS Cubed has science professional learning standards that reflect some of the things in Learning Forward's standards, but are absolutely focused on the standards around science professional learning. We also have, just a reminder for everyone, that resource is available on the NEXUS website, but that hand in hand, those two sets of standards can really help us, as we'll look at in a few minutes, in terms of the designing and thinking about long-term implementation of professional learning as it supports science teaching.
Yes, thank you, Sam and Kathy, for that. I think when the Learning Forward standards first came out, our biggest criticism where they were kind of content free, and we see a lot of places where that doesn't work. So thanks for that and that resource as well. So the other area of that we want to raise up around leader knowledge for professional learning is from our book on designing professional learning for teachers of science and mathematics. Kathy and I and colleagues have put together this really comprehensive guide to designing professional learning specifically for science and mathematics teachers. And we think it's another important tool within this book, is one that many of you, I think, know and have worked with us on, Roger and Susan Koba and others. But it really came out of some early work that Susan Laux-Horsley, our close colleague, did to explore and identify what she thought the 5 best models for professional development for making shifts to the old new standards back when NSCS and NCTM standards came out. And after engaging some of the leading professional developers in the country at this question of, what are the 5 best models, the answer that we came up with was, there's actually no one-size-fits-all model for professional development, but rather, professional development is a design task. So to use an engineering metaphor, that you have to really think through what are the different design components that need to be in place, and through them really come up with the design, whether we're talking about a professional learning experience on a small scale, such as a opportunity for a professional learning community to engage in some sort of a pod cycle or to reflect on learning, or whether we're talking at a large level of understanding, curriculum implementation largely. So we have came up with this version that's now in its, I guess, how old, Kathy? It's
Third iteration.
This is the third edition. We just wanted to, unpack it a little bit for you. I know this is maybe not new for all of you, but we think it is a critical tool for leaders to be thinking about as you not only design and provide professional learning around next generation science standards yourselves, but you help others too. And also in terms of thinking about if you're advising state education agency staff around thinking about how they should organize something on a state or regional level, there's critical help in looking at this framework. So basically, the PD design framework is fully explained in our book that I just showed you. And we've also developed a simulation game that some of you I know have seen. Susan Koba helped us with that game. And that is something that we can share with you if you and your team would like to explore this framework to increase your knowledge of how to design professional development or with science teachers. But our simulation game leads people through through an actual design and provision of PD process based on this framework. So basically, the PD design framework, if you're not familiar with it, is a process that you can use to design and plan implementation of PD. At the very center of the framework, they're illustrated in the blue boxes connected with the horizontal arrows, is the PD design, professional development design and implementation process. So it looks linear, even though it's somewhat linear, but more iterative, that we begin with committing to vision and standards, using data to understand student learning outcomes and other data that help inform what we want to do and why. And we use both the vision and our assessment of the data to set goals, and then to plan our professional development, to conduct the professional development, and then to evaluate results. And the orange arrow represents that this process is iterative, and reflection on data and results are informing the whole process to continue. Each action in the design and implementation process is influenced by what our team that developed this identified as 4 important inputs that are represented there by the 4 green circles. And these inputs help as someone who's really thinking through what's our professional development design to make informed decisions. So quickly, I'm just going to share a little bit, very little bit on each of these inputs. The first, knowledge and belief. I know this hardly happens anymore, but when we first started developing this work, we were surprised to learn how many people did not consult what was already known from research, and be able to, as our dear colleague Susan Lux-Horsley used to say, be able to stand on the shoulders of giants, start from what other people have done and know. And so we start with this idea that as leaders, we all need to be very, fluent in knowing some particular knowledge from research and what are accepted beliefs about that based on research. And the 5 areas that we identified, and this overlaps a lot with what you saw in the framework, that we need to understand and be informed by what we know about learners and learning, who our learners are, how they learn. We need to be informed by teachers and sort of the nature of teaching and what's possible in both the classroom and the lab, in the community, in terms of the teaching and the opportunity to learn. We have to know the nature of science and mathematics and what we are trying to model that content in all of the work that we're doing. And we have to understand how adults learn, and the need for, like, I don't think adults learn through webinars. My bias is always talking about adult learning on a webinar. But that's a critical area that we need to understand. And then to understand the change process, as Kathy mentioned earlier, that there's this over time change, and that it's developmental in nature, and it takes time and iterations and happens on a continuum. And yet, these are the 5 areas that we think are most critical to be thinking about when you begin to design. How are we making sure that what we know about learners and learning is reflected in our work, teachers and teaching, and these other areas? So we really start there with thinking about, and that informs the vision and standards that we set for the professional learning. And then we move to our second input. Well, I guess before we're going to move to our second input, we're going to ask a quick question for you to think about, just rather than discuss right now, because I think we are running a little late. Maybe just think about what's going on in your context that you believe is having an influence on your work to implement NGSS. And you can chat with each other about that in the chat while I continue to introduce the inputs. So no surprise, our second big input is context, and the thinking about really the design of your professional learning. It should be designed to fit and to reflect the local context where it is going to be. It helps you understand kind of the unique features of the local context and use that information to inform your professional development design. So who are the students in this context, and what are their learning needs? That will lead you to really select specific content that's designed to support students, that is right for them and for their, and it can be culturally responsive to the students in that context. Likewise, similar to knowing who the teachers are and maybe what's going on for them right now. In a lot of the states where we're working, there's a lot of tension about teaching, a real press for how can we make sure professional learning is putting teachers at the center, really amplifying their expertise, their professionalism, helping to kind of keep positive professional learning going on in some systems where there's votes to strike, where there's very difficult issues around pay and adequate pay. So all of that are key things that can really get in our way, but that we have to think about and design for as we think about professional development. In terms of leadership, likewise, you have to understand who are the school leaders in the places where you will be working. Are they supportive? Will they be able to help you and influence the professional development? Will they be able to support the teachers? And if not, how do we address that? Where will the leadership come from to make sure that the work we're doing around NGSS will in fact be taken up and supported in those sites? And I mentioned earlier the engagement of parents in their kids' education is really something we want to support, and to go beyond the typical ways the parents are involved, to really help families be involved in their children's learning. And so who are the families in the communities, and how could you really work with them and engage them in this work? So those are all contextual factors that we think it's very important for us as leaders of PD to be able to think about as we do our design. And then next, third input into our framework for you to think about, and these are called critical issues. They are things that in our early work, these are things that our partners and people we interviewed and talked with said, we got everything right, and then we didn't think about XYZ. And so these were the issues that we identified as ones that, as Susan Alex Horsley said, ignore them at your peril. These are, if we develop a beautiful, elegant implementation of NGSS and in one place, and we've invested all of this time, and we don't address how we're going to sustain it and build the capacity for sustainability, then we have little chance of seeing it continue. If we put together a comprehensive plan for supporting all the teachers, but it has to happen one Saturday morning a month, or 2 afternoons a year, and don't make the time for that professional development, that's just not going to work. I mean, the good news there is I think most of the professional development designs that we're working in now are very, by design and by requirement, job embedded, and making that time for professional development is really part of the regular school day. And we just want to continue to look for all the different ways to support districts and schools to do that. Developing the internal leadership, especially if something is being supported by the state or by a regional education center or an external consultant. Without developing that internal leadership, we just are only doing half of the job. And then, jumping down to the whole issue of professional learning culture, there often we found that there was a kind of a, we're trying to bring things in to schools or support a group of teachers to really grow a new practice without first kind of really stepping back and saying, what do we need to do to, make our practice public, to be able to collaborate, to be able to take risks with one another, to be able to trust one another, to be able to do all of those things that really are part of a professional learning culture. So as part of, the lessons have been more around, these must be critical, these critical issues must be part of your early design and thinking about how any kind of an intervention to support teachers around NGSS will work. Okay, we're almost at the end of this part. Professional development design framework, last input. This is always the one that people say, in our book, they said this was the, quote, sexy chapter, but because it was all the strategies for professional learning. But Kathy and I and our colleagues often caution people. I think what happens with professional development design is the 2 boxes you see lit up there on the slide right now are where people focus. They say we have to organize some professional learning, kind of what are we going to do? Okay, let's do it. And let's have a, let's put together a packet for the professional learning community. Let's think about doing a content immersion for our physical science teachers, but they don't really think about some of those earlier inputs that are critical to informing the plan and which strategies are most important. So in our book, there are some 16 odd different professional development strategies that we've called out that can be combined to meet the goals that you set, address the data that you've seen, and really get you to that vision informed by some of the critical issues in the context. And for the whole task of implementing NGSS and the the marriage of implementing new NGSS aligned instructional materials or units, or helping teachers develop units, we recommend and have seen the importance of combining multiple types of professional learning strategies into that design. So, for example, immersion in content is a critical part. Teachers should have the opportunity to learn the science content in a supported environment where they can feel comfortable and develop their own efficacy in that area. But that alone is not going to get us to the deep use of three-dimensional learning that we're after. We need to also build structures and strategies to support teachers to examine teaching and learning in regular ways. I think this is happening often through some version of professional learning communities or cycles of teaching and reflection that involve observation and dialogue among teachers, and the opportunity to do demonstration lessons or a version of continuous inquiry into teaching that looks like lesson study. So all of those, some of those examining teaching and learning strategies combined with immersion and content. And then moving down the list, there's a set of strategies around supporting the alignment and implementation of curriculum and engaging teachers, as we were talking earlier, and deeply understanding the standards, understanding why units and storylines have developed the way they are, and then working on the work of implementing those together in a reflective way. And finally, we identify different professional development structures that can be used in a variety of ways, which include study groups and PLCs and professional networks that can help you also to put together your design. So a variety of different strategies for different purposes must be a part of the overall design. So I will, let me just take a pause there and see, Kathy, would you like to add anything to our PD design framework?
The only thing I'll add to that real quickly is the idea of it being iterative, so that often we work with people where they're like, well, we have a plan. We've done all that other stuff and we want to focus in on the strategies, and Susan was talking about this. And sometimes when you get in depth into the plan do and thinking about the purposes and the who and the why and what the intended outcomes are, there's a pause and a reflection of, oh, I guess we don't have all of the contextual factors that we need in order to refine this plan. So I think it's not nearly as linear as it looks, and there are different entry points, so that when you're identifying places where strengthening your thinking and or the plan could enhance the work, it's always looping back on itself to sort of say, what do we not know about, what data do we not have to inform our understanding of the teachers and the students that we thought we might have had. So the iterative nature of it, I think, is important too.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Kathy. So let's move. So that is just a couple of areas in the knowledge of professional learning we think are important. There are many, many more, and we'll be happy to visit some more. Now we want to just go to the next slide and wrap up with what we need to know about systems change, and to think about, as I highlighted earlier when we talked about the big framework, we think it's critically important to pay attention to four areas to enact systems change. First of all, the whole our understanding, while systems change happens at a very macro level, one of our theories of action is that it's essential to really put people in the sort of the center of that systems don't change unless people change. And so paying attention to people and understanding where they are relative to the change is critically important. Connecting them to the why. Why are we doing this? And helping them to understand what they need along the way to move along a continuum, a developmental continuum of transition from previous practice to new practice. So as leaders, what we need there is to pay attention to that. We have to all understand that change is a very individual experience, that people change and move at different paces. Some people are very quick to make changes, and they can be surface changes. Others may be slower to make changes, but they result in deeper, longer lasting change. And so really stepping back and understanding who we're working with, where they are, what they need at any given point, and how that's helping to keep them moving into a deeper, expert use of new materials and new instructional strategies and new ways of engaging students and promoting agency are all what we need to be paying attention to, and helping. We're not the people who are in the buildings every day, so helping coaches, school leaders, other instructional leaders, and teachers themselves to have tools to think about where are they in their own use, what do they need to do next, and that it's, as continues along, you're not ever kind of done with any of this. So paying attention to people. The second area that we've called out as essential is this whole idea of being very clear about what the new practice looks like and what is involved and what teachers and others need to know and be able to do. Very often we've worked in situations where people are being engaged in a change effort, but there's been no clear definition, or if there's a defined vision of what the change is, and people, it results in sort of confusion, frustration, and other reactions that we just really want to avoid in trying to promote systems change. So doing our work as leaders, helping people to either clearly define, or if something is very much sort of in the adaptive space of unknown solution, at least working with people to come up with what we are going to do and try, and then how we're going to learn from that, and then how we're going to take next steps. Those are all critically important skills for leaders to be able to do. And then last two P's, very often we forget about policies, and you'll see that aligning policies is the first thing on our critical actions list in the framework. But it's not only aligning, but it may be enacting supportive policies that are not currently in place in the state district. And too often the policies that do exist can be barriers to what we're trying to do. So it could be issues around schedule, issues around credit hours, could be issues around access or taking kids out of the building, or any number of things that may get in the way of the vision of three-dimensional learning is. And so being carefully to step back and really be creative and thinking about what are the current policies, which are supporting us and which are not, and then working to eliminate those that are not working. And then finally, establishing and really institutionalizing the clear processes within districts for the important actions of curriculum implementation, curriculum selection, development, adoption, and how all of this fits with the district's talent management system, including teacher recruitment, induction, support, etc. So, okay, so I think we're going to just wrap up. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy to say a little bit about putting instructional materials in the center. And Yana, if you could just move one more slide forward.
It's the one with the, there you
Yeah,
go.
there you go.
Just wanted to sort of pull all of what Susan's been walking us through together in terms of thinking about, especially when she was talking about combining those different categories of strategies for professional learning. I think what we're seeing with NGSS is that that is in fact what's happening, so that immersion and content is not really its own strategy, but it can be the foundation for engaging and immersing teachers with the instructional materials themselves, and then supporting them through things like study groups and reflecting on practice, as well as the things they're doing in their classrooms to support the changes and the shifts they're making in both their teaching and the way in which students are learning. And that combination of multiple strategies to support teachers as they enact the materials, and then that longer term thinking about how are we cycling through the instructional materials. So have we paid attention to the critical issues around leadership, and what are we doing in our own regions, schools, districts, states to support teachers over time. So it might be enough to get teachers thinking and learning about one set of instructional materials or unit, but what happens next semester? What does that scaffolded professional learning look like to support teachers to deepen their understanding and changes in practice multiple years over time? And this was just a couple of examples. It's by no means a full list of some of the sources of thinking about instructional materials that are designing professional learning around them to support putting those materials at the center of the professional learning. And for those of you who are at the Institute, the sound experience was a next generation storyline unit experience around which we engaged with thinking and questioning and driving question boards. And the model of the NGSX platform for professional learning is grounded in the same kinds of learning experiences. And another project, Learn While Teaching, is also thinking about how to support teachers through virtual study groups as they enact those materials. Those three pieces of work plus others have contributed to the thinking and designing around how the Open SciEd instructional materials are actually being rolled out in states and districts, the facilitators who are leading that professional learning and providing both the in-person foundational professional learning and the ongoing virtual study group kind of experiences for teachers as they enact those units. Just some quick examples of a few things that are really thinking deeply about all of the professional development design framework components, as well as the knowledge and beliefs and the thinking that we've identified in the domains of the framework to help people thinking about how do we rethink professional learning so that it is grounded in the materials. So, sorry, I don't know what the next slide is, Susan.
Oh, sorry. I think we're running a little tight on time.
Yeah.
But I think we wanted to ask all of you, maybe move to the next slide, Anna, sorry. If there are any examples of professional learning focused on implementing instructional materials like Kathy just talked about that you're using, and sharing any examples of how your teams are planning instructional materials adoption and organizing professional learning for NGSS that might that you want to share. So that's, Kathy, was the next question.
Okay.
We only have about 1 minute left, so we may just want, if someone has something quick to say about, talk to me about something we're doing in Louisiana, you can put that in the chat and we'll follow up with you and try and get some of those examples out to folks.
So Susan, we did get a question in the chat asking about other opportunities or projects that WestEd is either managing or engaged in to help develop the leadership knowledge and leaders of folks implementing NGSS. So I know that NEXUS is probably one of the primary methods. There's probably some other things in the STEM group that you might want to mention, or Kathy, I don't know if you have other examples to bring up.
Well, sure. I'll just quickly mention that our Making Sense of Science group, which has developed a host of units around science topics for K-5 and through 6-8, have offer workshops and support for school leaders as well as district leaders around the implementation of standards-based materials that are reflected in their program. So we could put out a description of those courses. I think they are offered in sort of short, like the half day, the 1 day, the 2 day version, but they are very much focused on how do you support this kind of instruction at the building and district level. And I think, you know, moving forward, there are times when we've also offered more general 1 and 2 day kind of opportunities for leaders to come together and learn some more of the generic real skills around leading change, for example, where we've convened people to play the simulation game that I mentioned about using the design framework to think about what would a professional development design look like that is very aligned to standards, meets teacher needs, etc. So we could be sure to share a couple of those examples. Kathy, do you think the best way is the website?
Yeah, I think that's one way. And then as we continue to have conversations with members of individual NEXUS teams, I mean, this is obviously an area that we can support, make connections and links. Or if you're not on a NEXUS team, directly contacting us to have, you know, one-on-one conversations, and we can help you sort of design your own professional development plan, thinking about the design framework and what are the purposes, what more do you want to know and learn and be able to do. So please reach out to us individually, and we can absolutely continue the conversation.
And, you know, it would be possible maybe, Kathy, also to do a follow-up on our collection of our book, Leading Every Day, which is more of a collection of leadership practices across sort of across leading change, facilitating groups, professional development, as we've covered some of that today, and just the general leadership skills of what you do kind of every day to move people and support people in the direction of the new vision for science. So that might maybe be one of our webinars later this year.
Yes.
So thank you, everyone. It's been great to hear your comments and your chat comments, which we will archive and make this available. And please do follow up with the team and let us know how we can support you further. And I see a few people wanted some links to some resources, and we'll be sure and include those all in what we send out in the website. So thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. We will continue these conversations.
Have a great weekend, and it's
Yes.
May 1st, so from the Boston area where there's still snow on the ground, we are always happy when May 1st comes because the light is
March.
through the tunnel. Yes.
Susan, you're 2 months ahead of yourself.
Oh, March, I say May?
Yeah,
Oh.
you really want spring.
Okay, bye everyone. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Did I say it was May?